Picture this: a cold, misty morning in a quiet medieval village. The air is thick with tension as the townsfolk gather in the square, their breath visible in the frosty air. At the center of it all stands a condemned man, bound and resigned to his fate. The executioner raises his axe, the crowd holds its breath, and then the unimaginable happens. The blade falls, but the man lives, not just survives, but walks away unscathed, as if some unseen hand had intervened. In that moment, fear turns to awe, and whispers of a miracle ripple through the crowd. What was meant to be a routine execution becomes the spark of something extraordinary, a religious movement born from a single, inexplicable event. This is the story of how one failed execution transformed an entire village belief system, turning a condemned man into a figure of reverence. It's a tale that blurs the line between tragedy and divinity, where survival against all odds is seen not as luck, but as a sign from the heavens. How does a community react when the impossible happens right before their eyes? What happens when the rules of life and death seem to bend, and the ordinary suddenly feels touched by the divine? The answers lie in this forgotten chapter of history, a fleeting moment when faith, fear, and wonder collided to create something unforgettable, only to vanish as mysteriously as it began. Today, we're unraveling this strange and haunting episode, peeling back the layers of time to understand how a single event could ignite such profound belief and why it disappeared without a trace. Along the way, we'll explore the power of survival, the human need for meaning, and the mysteries that linger when history leaves us with more questions than answers. This isn't just a story about the past. It's a window into how easily the line between the mortal and the miraculous can blur, and how quickly legends are born. So join me as we step into the shadows of history, where one man's survival became a village revelation, and then, just as suddenly, faded into obscurity. To understand how one man's survival could shake an entire village to its core, we need to step back into the world these people inhabited. Medieval Europe was a place of strict order, where every person had their place. Nobles ruled, peasants toiled, and the church held sway over both body and soul. Public executions weren't just punishments, they were spectacles, carefully staged to reinforce the idea that authority was absolute and justice was divine. When the condemned stood on that scaffold, their fate wasn't just a lesson for them, it was a warning to everyone watching. Now imagine this village, nestled between dense forests and mist-shrouded hills. Life here was governed by rhythms older than memory: planting and harvest, feast and famine, the ever-present fear of plague or bandits. Superstition clung to every shadow. A failed crop, God's displeasure; a stillborn child, the work of witches. In such a world, the unexpected wasn't just strange, it was dangerous, and nothing was more unexpected than an execution that didn't take. So who was this condemned man? Records are scarce, but hints remain. Perhaps he was a thief caught stealing bread to feed his family. Maybe he was a heretic daring to question the village priest. Or worse, an innocent man denounced by a neighbor over a petty grudge. What matters isn't just who he was, but what he represented, a crack in the unshakable order of things. Because when the axe fell and he walked away unharmed, it wasn't just his life that was spared, it was the village's certainty. If the scaffold could fail, what else might be flawed? The church's teachings, the Lord's right to rule, the very nature of sin and salvation. This moment didn't just defy expectations, it upended them. In a society where miracles belonged to saints and martyrs, what did it mean when a common criminal or an innocent man seemed touched by the divine? The answer would transform not just his fate, but the faith of everyone who witnessed it, because in that breathless silence after the axe fell, something new was born. A doubt, then a whisper, then a belief that maybe, just maybe, the world wasn't as simple as they'd been told. The morning of the execution dawned grey and heavy, the kind of damp chill that seeped into bones and lingered. By sunrise, the village square was packed. Farmers leaving their fields, merchants shuttering stalls, children hoisted onto shoulders for a better view. The scaffold stood like a grim sentinel at the center, its weathered wood stained dark by seasons of rain and worse. A hush fell as the condemned man was led forward, his face pale but eerily calm. Some in the crowd crossed themselves, others leaned in, hungry for the spectacle. The executioner, a burly figure wrapped in a hooded cloak, tested the edge of his axe with a thumb, the metallic whisper cutting through the silence. Then came the moment that would echo through generations. The prisoner knelt, the axe rose, and when it fell, the unthinkable happened. Perhaps the blade glanced off the block, diverted by a hidden knot in the wood. Maybe the rope snapped or the noose slipped. What's certain is that the man staggered to his feet, unharmed, while the executioner gaped at his own hands as if they'd betrayed him. Gasps tore through the crowd, then murmurs, then something louder, a rising buzz of voices weaving speculation into certainty. A miracle, someone cried. A sign, another insisted. Even the village priest who'd come to bless the proceedings hesitated, his prayer book trembling in his grip. Primary accounts from nearby monasteries described the scene in hushed tones. One chronicler writes of birds suddenly taking flight from the rooftops, as if startled by an unseen force. Another notes how the village dogs, usually silent at such gatherings, began howling in unison moments before the axe struck. Whether by chance or providence, the failure was too precise, too timely, to dismiss as mere accident. And in a world where the divine spoke through storms and harvests, the message seemed clear. This man was marked by something beyond mortal judgment. By nightfall, the scaffold stood empty, but the square remained alive with whispers. Some claimed to have seen a halo of light around the prisoner's head as he walked away. Others swore the executioner's axe had shattered mid-swing, though no fragments were ever found. What began as a botched punishment became a ripple of awe, spreading from house to house, until even the skeptical found themselves questioning. If the law could falter, then what else might be possible? If death itself could be defied, then who or what had intervened? The answers would soon reshape the village's very soul, turning fear into fervor, and a criminal into something far more dangerous, a prophet. Chaos erupted in the village square as the condemned man stood unharmed. The executioner's hands shook, his confidence shattered. The crowd, moments ago silent with anticipation, now buzzed with a frenetic energy, part terror, part exhilaration. A woman near the scaffold fell to her knees, clutching her rosary as if it might burn her fingers. A miracle, she sobbed, and the word spread through the throng like a spark through dry tinder. By midday, the story had already warped and grown. Some swore the man had laughed as the axe struck, others that a gust of wind had diverted the blade at the last second. But the most persistent rumor was the simplest: divine intervention. The village priest, a stern man who'd spent decades enforcing doctrine, found himself outmatched by the fervor of his own flock. He tried to quell the excitement, insisting the event was a fluke, a trick of the light, but his words were drowned out by the growing chorus of believers. The condemned man, once a figure of pity or scorn, was now surrounded by villagers pressing forward to touch his sleeve, his hands, as if his very skin might carry a blessing. A farmer thrust a sick child into his arms, begging for healing. A blacksmith, his face streaked with soot and tears, declared the man a living saint. And with each passing hour, the legend grew thicker, wilder, more irresistible. Meanwhile, the local lord's men watched from the edges of the square, their expressions unreadable. This wasn't just a disruption, it was a threat. The scaffold was meant to be the final word, the ultimate demonstration of power. Now, the people were looking past it, past the church, past the nobility, towards something they couldn't control. By nightfall, orders were given to rearrest the man, but the villagers had already hidden him away, weaving him into the safety of their homes and their newfound faith. What began as whispers in the square became rituals by moonlight. Candles flickered in windows where none had burned before. Offerings of bread, coins, and flowers appeared at the foot of the scaffold, now less a symbol of death than of defiance. The condemned man's name, once forgotten, was spoken in reverent tones when it was spoken at all. Some called him the Unbroken, others the Messenger. A few, daringly, compared him to ancient martyrs, and with every passing day, the rift between the village and its rulers deepened, fueled by something far more dangerous than rebellion, the unshakable belief that heaven itself had taken a side. The authorities scoffed, of course. They called it madness, superstition, the hysterical delusions of simple minds. But try as they might, they couldn't stamp out the embers of what had been lit that morning. Because miracles, real or imagined, have a way of outlasting the men who deny them. And in the shadow of that failed execution, something new was stirring, not just a story, not just a legend, but the seeds of a faith that would, for a brief and blazing moment, rewrite the rules of an entire community. The movement didn't begin with sermons or scriptures, it began with a single, stunned silence. In the days after the failed execution, the survivor said little. He wasn't a preacher by nature, just a man who'd stared death in the face and walked away. But his silence became a canvas for the village's hopes. Where he wouldn't speak, others filled the gaps with divine meaning. A chance remark about the weather became a prophecy. His refusal to flee the village was seen as a sacred mission. The people weren't following his words, they were following the mystery he embodied. Rituals sprouted like wildflowers after a storm. Villagers began leaving offerings at the scaffold. Not just flowers or coins, but scraps of parchment with prayers scrawled in clumsy hands. Someone claimed the executioner's block had healed their child's fever, and soon pilgrims from nearby hamlets were pressing their foreheads to its scarred surface. A local artisan carved the survivor's likeness into a piece of oak, and within weeks, dozens of these crude icons hung in doorways, their chipped eyes watching over hearths and cradles. The authorities scoffed, but they couldn't erase the quiet defiance in these acts. Every candle lit, every whispered prayer, was a small rebellion against the rigid order that had once ruled their lives. The movement's heart, though, lay in the night gatherings. As dusk fell, villagers would slip away to the forest's edge where torches flickered between the trees. There, they'd share stories not just of the survivor's miracle, but of their own suffering. A widow spoke of her husband, hanged for stealing a loaf of bread. A shepherd's son described the Lord's men seizing their flock as taxes. The survivor rarely spoke at these meetings, but his presence was enough. In him, they saw proof that the world's cruelty wasn't absolute, that sometimes, against all odds, the rope snapped, the axe turned, and the powerless walked free. By the time summer faded, the village had transformed. The church pews stood empty, while the scaffold, once a symbol of terror, became a shrine draped in ribbons and garlands. Travelers arrived daily, some seeking healing, others just to touch the hem of the survivor's threadbare cloak. A few even brought their own condemned loved ones, begging for his intercession. The local lord, sensing the shift, tried to crush it, sending soldiers to disperse the gatherings, burning the makeshift icons. But the harder he pressed, the brighter the faith burned. At its peak, the movement wasn't just a religion, it was a quiet revolution. The survivor never claimed to be a messiah, but in a world where peasants bowed and starved, his mere existence became a testament to something greater, the idea that no law, no blade, no earthly power was final. And for one fleeting season, that idea turned a forgotten village into a beacon, drawing the desperate and the hopeful from miles around. They came not for grand cathedrals or learned theologians, but for the simple, terrifying hope that miracles could still happen, and that sometimes they happen to people just like them. The survivor's place in this unfolding drama was anything but simple. Was he a prophet, divinely chosen to deliver a message, or merely a man caught in the whirlwind of others' desperate need to believe? The truth, as always, lies somewhere in the shadows between. Contemporary accounts paint a fractured picture. Some describe him as a radiant figure, speaking in parables and healing the sick with a touch. Others insist he was a quiet, hollow-eyed man who flinched at the crowds, as bewildered by his own survival as anyone. One village elder's journal, discovered centuries later in a monastery archive, recounts how the survivor would often slip away at dawn to walk alone in the fields, his hands clasped behind his back like a prisoner still bound by invisible ropes. When pressed to bless a child or interpret a dream, he'd hesitate, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know why I lived," he confessed once to a blacksmith's wife. But it wasn't for this. Yet the very next day, the same witness describes him standing atop the scaffold, now a makeshift pulpit, his voice suddenly strong as he told the crowd, "The axe failed because heaven has greater hunger than the grave." This contradiction lies at the heart of the mystery. Did the survivor come to believe his own legend, or was he performing a role thrust upon him? Some scholars argue he was a reluctant figurehead, manipulated by villagers who needed a living symbol to justify their defiance. A fragmentary letter from the local Lord Steward complains that the man refused to play the martyr when arrested a second time, begging for mercy instead of embracing martyrdom. Yet other records suggest moments of startling conviction, like when he allegedly faced down armed soldiers by calmly extending his wrists for new shackles, saying, "Cut deeper this time. Let's see if your iron can match God's jest." Perhaps the most revealing clue comes from an unlikely source, the executioner himself. In a rare personal account buried in a regional tax ledger, the hooded man writes of encountering the survivor months later by chance at a crossroads. "He asked me for a coin, not recognition," the executioner notes, bewildered. "When I said the village now calls him the Unbroken, he laughed until he coughed blood. Then he said they should call me the Unlucky, death takes the willing first." This tension between the man and the myth shaped the movement's strange, fleeting power. Had the survivor boldly claimed divine favor, the church might have crushed him as a heretic. Had he wholly rejected his role, the villagers' faith might have fizzled into mere gossip. Instead, his ambiguity became fertile ground. The less he said, the more meanings others could project. When he vanished one winter night, whether fleeing, kidnapped, or simply walking into the woods, it only cemented his legend. Because how better for a miracle to end than with another unanswered question? What lingers isn't just the mystery of who he really was, but what his story reveals about the alchemy of belief. In a different time, he might have been forgotten as a lucky criminal. But in that village, in that moment, he became the blank page on which an entire community wrote their hopes, their rage, and their longing for a world where the powerless could cheat the blade. His greatest legacy wasn't in what he did, but in what others dared to imagine because of him, and that, perhaps, is the most miraculous thing of all. The village square, once a place of markets and magistrates, became a tapestry of devotion. Where the executioner's block had stood, A rough-hewn altar now rose, its wooden planks polished smooth by the hands of countless pilgrims. Every morning at dawn, villagers gathered there not by decree but by quiet compulsion. They lit candles not just for the survivor, but for their own lost loved ones, their own unspoken hopes. The local blacksmith, once known for shoeing horses, now forged tiny iron charms, crude replicas of the axe that had failed to strike. Mothers hung them above cradles, laborers tucked them into their belts. Even the well at the center of town took on new meaning. Its water, once just water, was now said to carry blessings. Travelers would fill flasks to carry home, whispering promises of healing. Meanwhile, the church stood half empty, its priest pacing the aisles in frustration. He'd spent years teaching scripture, only to watch his flock turn toward something raw and untamed. They pray to a scaffold now, he wrote in a letter to his bishop, the ink blotted with anger. They call a criminal's luck divine intervention. His words betray a deeper fear, not just of heresy, but of a faith that required no Latin, no tithes, no intermediaries between the people and the miraculous. Archaeologists centuries later would uncover traces of this transformation, a layer of ash in the square, evidence of countless votive candles. They'd find the remnants of the altar, its base studded with nails driven in by devotees, each one a silent plea. Most telling, though, were the fragments of pottery scattered nearby, their surfaces etched with symbols not crosses, but axes, ropes, and outstretched hands. These weren't the marks of a sanctioned religion, but of something far more dangerous, a belief forged by the people themselves. Neighboring villages watched with a mix of fascination and dread. Some sent envoys to witness the axe saint, returning with stories that spread like wildfire. Others, egged on by their own clergy, called it blasphemy. A chronicle from a nearby town describes a group of youths who tried to steal a piece of the scaffold as a relic, only to be chased off by villagers armed with scythes and torches. The movement wasn't just spreading, it was hardening into defiance, but shadows were gathering at the edges of this newfound faith. The local lord, once content to ignore peasant superstitions, now saw his authority eroding. Taxes went unpaid, laborers skipped their duties to attend dawn vigils. Worse, whispers reached him that some villagers were refusing to swear oaths in the church, invoking the survivor's name instead. Meanwhile, the bishop's letters grew increasingly urgent, demanding action before this scaffold cult infected the entire region. By the time the first frost came, the village existed in a fragile balance, part sanctuary, part powder keg. The survivor's followers had turned his story into something larger than life, but in doing so, they'd drawn the gaze of powers far less forgiving than an executioner's blade. And as winter's grip tightened, so too did the noose of politics and dogma, tightening around a movement that had dared to imagine a world where miracles belonged to the common folk. The bishop's letter arrived on a morning crusted with frost, its wax seal pressed deep with the mark of the church's authority. It left no room for ambiguity. This so-called miracle, it declared, is nothing but the devil's trickery meant to lead simple souls astray. The village priest read it aloud from the church steps, his voice trembling not with conviction, but with fear because the crowd gathered below wasn't bowing their heads in shame. They stood silent, their breath clouding the air, their eyes fixed on the scaffold turned, altar at the square's center. For generations, the church had been the final word on matters of the divine. Now, for the first time, its words were meeting something unexpected: indifference. The backlash unfolded in stages, each more severe than the last. First came the sermons, fiery diatribes warning of eternal damnation for those who venerated a false saint. Then the threats: refuse the sacraments, and your child couldn't be baptized. Cling to this heresy, and your dying mother would be denied last rites. The village's wealthiest farmer was summoned before the bishop's court and fined a year's harvest for harboring idolatrous objects, his daughter's small wooden carving of the survivor. But the harshest blow was excommunication. One by one, the movement's most vocal followers were cast out of the church, their names read aloud like a roll call of the damned. In a world where salvation was the currency of life, this should have been the end, yet something remarkable happened. The excommunicated didn't slink back to confession. They gathered instead at the scaffold, where a weaver's wife, once too timid to speak in public, stood and recited prayers she'd composed herself. Without priests to bless them, couples exchanged vows by clasping hands over the executioner's block. The dead were buried not in consecrated ground, but in a meadow where wildflowers grew thick, their graves marked with axes carved into stone. The church had wielded spiritual isolation as its ultimate weapon, only to watch the villagers build a new kind of communion from the scraps of their old faith. Behind the scenes, though, cracks were forming. Some began slipping back to mass under cover of darkness, unable to bear the weight of eternal exile. Others grew reckless, taunting the priest by nailing their excommunication notices to the church door. The movement's unity, once its greatest strength, now frayed between those who saw Defiance as sacred and those who feared they'd traded their souls for a fleeting moment of rebellion. Meanwhile, the bishop's agents fanned out to neighboring towns, spreading warnings of a plague of pride infecting the village. Pilgrims who once traveled to touch the scaffold now found themselves turned away at inns, their coins refused lest heresy cling to them like a scent. The village, once a beacon, was becoming an island, and the tide was rising. By winter's end, the church would deploy its most devastating tactic yet, not just condemning the living but rewriting the dead. Graves in the meadow were desecrated under cover of night, their markers smashed. The bishop's new decree declared that any who died outside the church's grace would be erased from memory, their names struck from parish records, their existence undone. It was a cruelty as psychological as it was spiritual, and it worked. Slowly, silently, families began returning to the pews, their heads bowed not in piety but exhaustion. The movement didn't collapse, it eroded, worn down by the relentless pressure of a world that refused to bend. Yet even in retreat, something indelible remained. Because faith, once awakened, doesn't vanish, it hides. In the way a mother still tied an iron axe charm around a child's neck beneath their tunic. In the way old men would tap the scaffold's wood twice for luck before a journey. And in the way, decades later, travelers could still find villagers who'd lower their voices to tell of the time death itself blinked, and for one fleeting season, the powerless held heaven in their hands. The local lord watched from the battlements of his manor as the village transformed beneath him. At first, he'd dismissed the failed execution as peasant nonsense, superstitious chatter that would fade with the next harvest. But as weeks passed and the scaffold became a shrine, his patience curdled into unease. This wasn't just about religion, it was about control. Taxes went uncollected. Fields lay fallow while villagers knelt in the square. Worse, whispers reached him of laborers refusing to work his lands, claiming the unbroken had declared all men equal under heaven. For a lord whose power depended on the unshakable hierarchy of feudalism, such ideas were more dangerous than any plague. His response was a masterclass in medieval realpolitik. Publicly, he played the cautious observer, wary of provoking a movement that had grown too popular to crush outright. Privately, he sent envoys to the bishop, offering men at arms to restore order, in exchange for leniency on his own long-overdue tithe. The church, desperate to stem the heresy, agreed. Together, they devised a strategy of slow suffocation, not with swords, but with parchment and ink. the Lord issued decrees banning gatherings after sundown, citing bandit activity. He doubled fines for missed labor obligations, knowing full well the villagers had spent their coin on votive candles instead of seed. And when a delegation of believers came to petition for mercy, he received them not in his hall, but in the shadow of the scaffold, a silent reminder of where authority truly lay. Yet the movement's most fatal wound came from within. As pressure mounted, fractures appeared among the faithful. The village's wealthier families, those with grain stores to lose, began distancing themselves, quietly resuming church attendance while still hanging axe charms in their barns. Younger followers, radicalized by persecution, argued for open defiance, even sabotage. Tensions erupted when a group of them burned the Lord's tax records, only to be denounced by their own elders who feared collective punishment. The survivor, once a unifying figure, became a pawn in these divisions. Traditionalists saw him as a passive vessel for divine will. Reformers demanded he lead an uprising. His reluctance to choose a side left both factions disillusioned. The final betrayal came on a night of driving rain. A blacksmith's apprentice, caught stealing sacramental wine from the church, was offered clemency in exchange for names. By dawn, the Lord's soldiers were dragging believers from their beds. The survivor vanished that same night, whether fleeing, seized, or spirited away by his remaining followers, no one could say. What remained was a village hollowed out, its altars dismantled, its fervor spent. The Lord, ever pragmatic, allowed one concession. The scaffold stayed standing, its wood too soaked with myth to ever again serve as mere gallows. But its power was neutered, its miracles reduced to folktales told in whispers. The axe that failed to kill a man had, in the end, cleaved a community in two, proving that while faith might move mountains, politics would always decide where they fell. Without a central doctrine or clear leadership, the movement began to splinter like cracked ice underfoot. The survivors' silence had once been a unifying mystery, but now it became a void filled with clashing interpretations. Some saw him as a passive vessel of divine will, arguing that his survival alone was the miracle proof that heaven favored the humble. Others insisted he'd been spared to deliver a message, one they were all too eager to articulate on his behalf. A cobbler named Matthias, who'd lost 2 sons to famine, began preaching that the survivor's endurance meant God rejected earthly rulers entirely. Why kneel to lords when the scaffold failed? He'd cry, drawing crowds to the square with his fiery rhetoric. Meanwhile, the village's only literate woman, a widow named Elspeth, circulated handwritten scrolls claiming the survivor's survival signaled an end to all hierarchies, even between men and women. The first open rift came during a harvest moon gathering. Matthias demanded the destruction of the Lord's granary as an offering to justice. Elspeth countered that true faith required peaceful withdrawal, a separate community living beyond the reach of tyrants. When the survivor refused to endorse either vision, frustration boiled over. A faction of young men, led by a hot-tempered charcoal burner named Henrik, began sneaking out at night to slash the Lord's hunting nets and sabotage mill wheels, acts they called holy mischief. The more cautious elders, fearing retaliation, openly scorned them at the next gathering. "You'll get us all hanged," shouted a potter whose brother had been the executioner's first victim. Henrik retorted by hurling a clod of dirt at the altar, scattering ashes across the crowd. Personal grudges soon intertwined with theology. Elspeth accused Matthias of twisting the survivor's story for personal glory, noting how he'd begun accepting gifts of food from admirers. Matthias, in turn, mocked her scrolls as hedge-witch ramblings. The survivor, overwhelmed, withdrew further, spending days alone in the forest. His absence only fueled the chaos. A group of weavers, disillusioned by the infighting, broke away to form their own sect in an abandoned sheepfold. where they practiced silent meditation they claimed mirrored the survivors' sacred stillness. Others, like the blacksmith's family, clung to the original miracle but rejected all new rituals, arguing that adding anything to that single moment of grace was blasphemy. The most damaging fracture came when Henrik's followers began marking doors with charcoal axes, a symbol meant to protect households loyal to their militant vision. Overnight, the village became a patchwork of alliances and suspicions. Neighbors who'd once stood shoulder to shoulder at the scaffold now crossed the square to avoid one another. The Lord's spies, quick to exploit the discord, spread rumors that Elsbeth's scrolls contained love spells targeting the survivor, while Matthias was accused of hoarding food meant for the poor. By the time winter winds howled through the village, the movement had shattered into a dozen shards, each sharp enough to draw blood, but too small to withstand what was coming. What began as shared awe had curdled into something darker, a contest over who owned the miracle, who spoke for the divine, and in their fervor to define the truth, the villagers forgot the one thing that had made their faith dangerous: its unity. The survivors' greatest lesson might have been that power could falter, but in the end, they proved just as vulnerable to the oldest trap of all: division. The survivor vanished on a night so still, even the owls held their tongues. One evening, he stood among his followers at the scaffold altar, his face gaunt in the torchlight. By morning, he was gone without so much as a footprint in the dew. The villagers woke to an eerie quiet, no whispered prayers at his door, no clink of offerings left by pilgrims, just an empty space where he'd last slept, the straw pallet undisturbed as if no one had ever lain there. Panic rippled through the community. Had he fled the growing tensions, been taken by the Lord's men under cover of darkness, or, as some dared to whisper, had he simply stepped beyond the veil of the mortal world, his purpose fulfilled? Theories sprouted like weeds after rain. A charcoal burner swore he'd seen shadowy figures carrying a limp body toward the marshes. The weaver's wife claimed to have dreamed of him walking into a column of light, his shackles falling away like dried mud. Meanwhile, the Lord's steward made a show of inspecting the roads, declaring the man a coward who'd abandoned his deluded followers. But the most haunting account came from a shepherd boy who insisted he'd seen the survivor at dawn, standing knee-deep in the river. He wasn't washing or drinking, the boy stammered, just staring at his hands like they weren't his own. Then the current took him, not pulling, not drowning. Like the water was making room for him, his absence left a void no one could fill. Matthias and Elsbeth, once at odds, now scrambled to reinterpret his every past gesture as prophecy. He knew this would happen, Matthias insisted, brandishing a rusted nail the survivor had once touched. He left us the tools to finish his work. Elsbeth, ever the pragmatist, quietly collected his few belongings, a chipped cup, a patched cloak, and declared them relics. But the magic had seeped from the movement. Pilgrims still came, but their offerings grew meager. The night gatherings dwindled as families, fearing the Lord's retribution, retreated behind locked doors. Yet in the silence, something stranger took root. A rumor began circulating that the survivor wasn't truly gone, that he walked the forests at twilight, visible only to those pure of heart. A miller's daughter swore she'd handed him a loaf of bread near the old oak, only to blink and find it uneaten on the ground. An elderly farmer claimed the man's laughter echoed from empty barns. These weren't just stories, they were lifelines for a faith unraveling under scrutiny. Because if the survivor could vanish without a trace, perhaps he'd never been ordinary at all. Perhaps he'd always belonged to the realm of whispers and shadows, where axes could fail and men could slip through the cracks of history itself. By spring, even these tales faded. The Lord ordered the scaffold dismantled, its timbers burned to ash. the bishop's scribes meticulously expunged all mention of the events from parish records. But in the quiet corners of the village, in the way mothers still tucked iron charms into swaddling clothes, in the way old men spat at the executioner's name, the survivor lingered. Not as a saint, not as a martyr, but as a question etched into the grain of everyday life. Because the greatest mystery wasn't where he'd gone, but why his disappearance felt, to those who'd loved him, like another miracle. One final act of defiance against a world that demanded endings. The movement didn't collapse in a single dramatic moment. It unraveled like a frayed rope, strand by strand. At first, the changes were subtle. Fewer villagers gathered at the scaffold at dawn. The offerings left there grew sparser, no longer loaves of bread or handfuls of coins, but wilted wildflowers, pebbles arranged in clumsy patterns. The night meetings, once alive with debate and song, dwindled to a handful of diehards huddled under cloaks, their voices barely carrying over the wind. Even the children who'd once played at being the unbroken with sticks for axes moved on to new games. The authorities didn't need to crush the faith outright. They simply made it inconvenient to keep. The Lord's tax collectors, once willing to overlook late payments, now arrived with armed guards and ledgers thick with penalties. Families who'd openly worn iron charms found their grain stores mysteriously spoiled by rats. The village priest, though still despised, began offering absolution to those who renounced the movement, a tempting offer for parents who feared their children would inherit not just their poverty, but their excommunication. One by one, the faithful slipped back into the pews, their heads bowed not in reverence but resignation. The scaffold's final desecration came on a rain-soaked morning. The Lord's carpenter, a man whose own brother had once kissed the executioner's block as a relic, arrived with a team of laborers. They pried up the altar's planks, tossing them onto a bonfire that hissed and spat in the downpour. A few villagers watched from their doorways, but no one protested. The carpenter made a show of keeping one charred splinter, to remind you all what comes of folly. He sneered, but by noon, even that was forgotten in the mud. Yet traces lingered like smoke clinging to wool. The well's water might no longer be called holy, but mothers still brought sick infants to drink from it at dawn. Travelers asking after the axe saint were met with shrugs, but sometimes if the night was dark and the ale flowed freely, an old farmer might lean in and murmur, "I saw him, you know." Not with my eyes, but here, tapping his chest. The Lord's scribes might have scratched the survivor's name from their records, but they couldn't erase the way the village marked time. Not by the bishop's visits or the harvest, but by the year the blade turned. By the time a generation had passed, the movement existed only in fragments. A lullaby about a man who laughed at the gallows, a superstition about touching iron before a journey, an old woman who still left a crust of bread at the crossroads on Midwinter's Eve. The church stood full again, the hymns louder than ever, as if to drown out the whispers, but in the quiet moments when the wind rattled the shutters just so, or the firelight cast axe-shaped shadows on the wall, something still stirred. Not faith, not rebellion, but the unshakable knowledge that for one fleeting season the rules had bent, and once bent, they could never quite seem whole again. Legends have a way of outlasting the facts that birthed them. Long after the scaffold's ashes cooled and the village returned to the rhythms of ordinary life, whispers of the survivor clung to the landscape like morning mist. Parents warned their children not to wander near the old execution site after dark, where some claimed to hear the faint creak of a rope in windless air. The river where the shepherd boy had last seen the survivor became a place of hushed reverence. Fishermen would toss a crust of bread into the current before casting their nets, a silent offering to whatever still walked there. The movement's relics took on lives of their own. A tattered cloak, said to be the survivor's, was hidden beneath the floorboards of a farmhouse for generations, brought out only to drape over the sick in hopes of healing. Fragments of the scaffold, smuggled away before its burning, were carved into tiny amulets passed down as secret heirlooms. One particularly vivid tale spoke of a black axe hidden in the marshes, a weapon forged from the executioner's shattered blade, waiting for a time when its edge would be needed again. These weren't just keepsakes, they were acts of quiet resistance, a way for the powerless to keep hold of a story that the powerful had tried to erase. As the centuries turned, the survivor's memory fractured into a dozen folktales, each tailored to fit new fears and hopes. In one version, he became a spectral judge, appearing at crossroads to test travelers' honesty. In another, he was a trickster figure, outwitting devils and lords alike with his uncanny survival. The most haunting iteration cast him as an eternal wanderer, doomed to walk the earth until every injustice was righted, a ghost with blistered feet and empty hands, glimpsed sometimes in the fog between the trees. Modern historians piecing together this puzzle faced a challenge: how to separate fact from faith. Parish records showed gaps where pages had been carefully excised, their cuts too precise to blame on time alone. A 19th-century antiquarian's diary mentioned discovering a cache of heretical writings in a village attic, only to have them crumble to dust when handled. The breakthrough came in the 1980s when a researcher studying tax rolls noticed an anomaly, a sudden, unexplained dip in the Lord's income the year after the failed execution, followed by a surge in payments to the church. The paper trail, dry as it was, hinted at something the legends had obscured, not just a spiritual rebellion but an economic one. Today, the stories endure in fragments, a lullaby half-remembered, a strange marking on a barn door, the way some elders still touch iron when passing the overgrown patch where the scaffold once stood. What began as a miracle became a myth and then a whisper, but never quite faded away, because some truths don't need institutions to survive. They just need someone somewhere to keep asking, what if it really happened? And in that question, the past keeps its grip on the present, light as a breath on the back of the neck. Archaeologists digging through the village soil centuries later found more than just arrowheads and pottery shards. They uncovered whispers of a faith that refused to stay buried. The most striking discovery was a shallow pit near the old execution site, filled with what scholars first mistook for ordinary trash: broken clay lamps, twisted iron nails, and animal bones. But the arrangement told a different story. The nails formed crude axe shapes, the bones were charred but not gnawed, evidence of ritual fires, not kitchen scraps. And those lamps, their wicks had been snipped short, a practice usually reserved for graves, as if lighting the way for spirits. Here, it seemed, devotees had held their own version of last rites, mourning a movement rather than a person. Then there were the walls. Beneath layers of whitewash in the village's oldest cottages, researchers found etchings, not the usual crosses or saints, but stark outlines of gallows, their ropes dangling empty. One farmhouse cellar revealed a stunning mural, a hooded figure with arms outstretched, not in crucifixion but in defiance, while townsfolk knelt with tools instead of prayer books. The artistry was clumsy, the pigments faded, but the message was clear: this wasn't just worship, it was reclamation. The tools in those painted hands matched real artifacts found nearby. A blacksmith's hammer buried upright like a cross, a weaver's shuttle tucked into the church foundation, as if sealing their craft into its bones. But the most haunting find came from the riverbank. A child's wooden doll, its face worn smooth by time, had been hidden in a hollow tree trunk. Its apron was stitched with tiny iron beads, each one shaped like an axe head. Radiocarbon dating placed it squarely in the movement's era, a silent testament to how deep the faith had reached. Parents had risked everything to pass this hope to their children, weaving protection into something as simple as a plaything. Yet for every answer, the dirt yielded new riddles. A cache of silver coins near the Lord's manor bore strange scratches, not random vandalism, but deliberate defacement of the ruler's profile. Were they payment refused, a protest melted down into currency? And why did every excavated hearth contain a single unburned wheat stalk, snapped cleanly in two? The villagers left no scriptures, no grand temples, just these fragile, furious fingerprints on history. Even now, archaeologists debate what to call them: relics or rebellion, devotion or defiance. Perhaps they were always both. The greatest enigma lies in what hasn't been found. No grave for the survivor, no personal effects beyond dubious claims. Just a single iron ring, too small for a man's finger, discovered wedged between the stones of the old well. Its inside was inscribed with two words in crude lettering: remember and forget. A contradiction that sums up the movement itself, a faith built on absence, a revolution that lives on precisely because it vanished without a trace. The medieval chronicles that mention the failed execution and its aftermath are a tapestry of contradictions, each thread colored by the writer's allegiance. Church scribes, quick to label the movement as heresy, described it in terms dripping with disdain. One bishop's ledger calls it a carnival of the damned, painting the villagers as gullible fools seduced by the devil's sleight of hand. Yet between the lines of these condemnations, glimpses of truth peek through. When a monk writes that followers adored the scaffold as if it were the true cross, his scorn betrays just how deeply the movement unsettled the establishment. After all, you don't spend parchment vilifying something unless it poses a real threat. On the other side, fragments of pro-movement text survive like embers in ash. A smuggled letter hidden inside a psalter praises the survivor as God's own jest upon the mighty. Another, etched hastily on sheepskin, lists miracles attributed to the scaffold: a blind woman seeing colors, a stillborn child drawing breath for 1 hour in its mother's arms. These accounts, though likely embellished, reveal something raw and human beneath the legend. Not just reverence for the survivor, but a desperate hope that the powerless could, even briefly, rewrite their fate. The most revealing records, though, are the ones that barely mention the movement at all. Tax rolls show the Lord's income halved the year after the execution failed, suggesting widespread refusal to pay tithes. Court documents list unusual punishments: a man sentenced to the stocks for singing a forbidden hymn, a woman fined for keeping iron in wrongful shapes. These dry administrative notes, free from theological grandstanding, expose the real stakes. This wasn't just a spiritual rebellion. It was a challenge to the entire feudal order, where even a song or a scrap of metal could become an act of defiance. Then there are the silences. The bishop's diary skips entire months during the movement's peak, its pages suspiciously pristine where others are stained with ink and wine. The village's own records from that year are missing, likely burned, but not before someone scrawled a single phrase on the inside cover: "The axe remembers what the book forgets." What emerges from these fragments isn't just a story of faith, but a portrait of a society trembling at its own edges. The chronicles, whether they sneer or celebrate, agree on one thing: for a fleeting moment, the rules didn't apply. And that possibility, that the scaffold could fail, that a nobody could become sacred, was enough to make both priests and princes reach for their quills, not to record history, but to control it. History is littered with the bones of failed executions and the strange faiths that grew around them. Take the case of Margaret Dixon in 18th century Scotland, hanged for infanticide, only to wake in her coffin hours later. The law declared her sentence carried out, and she walked free, her survival spawning ballads and a macabre tavern toast. Here's to half-hanged Maggie. Like our medieval survivor, her brush with death became a public spectacle, proof that the gallows' grip wasn't absolute. Yet, unlike the village's fervor, Maggie's tale never sparked worship. The difference: timing. In an age of growing skepticism, her miracle was chalked up to luck, not divine intervention. Then there's the infamous living gallows of 17th century Germany, where a young thief named Matthias survived 3 hanging attempts before the executioner refused a 4th. Crowds hailed him as the rope's master, and local women braided cords from the failed nooses, believing them to ward off evil. This superstition mirrored our villagers' axe charms, but with a crucial twist. Matthias' cult faded within months, snuffed out by Lutheran reformers who branded it papist nonsense. The medieval movement, by contrast, flourished in the gaps of a church already straining under peasant discontent. Perhaps the closest parallel lies in the Caribbean, where enslaved Africans in the 19th century revered a man named Bachman, said to have survived a firing squad unscathed. His legend became a beacon for revolt, blending Christian imagery with ancestral spirit beliefs. Like our survivor, Bachman's power came not from sermons, but from the sheer audacity of his survival. Yet where Bachman's followers wove his story into organized rebellion, the medieval villagers lacked a clear enemy beyond the system. Their faith was purer in its ambiguity, a protest without a manifesto, written in candles and whispered prayers. What sets our medieval case apart is its fragility. Most execution-born cults either hardened into lasting sects or vanished without a trace. This movement did both, burning bright enough to rattle the powerful, yet too fleeting to be fully erased. Its legacy isn't in grand cathedrals or sacred texts, but in the quiet cracks of history, the way a farmer might still pause at a weathered stone, or how a mother hums an old lullaby without knowing why. Which brings us to why this story grips us today. In an era of deep fakes and disillusionment, there's something primal about a miracle that can't be faked, a moment when death itself flinched. We see echoes of it in modern fascination with near-death experiences, or the way viral videos of improbable survivals still make us catch our breath. The medieval villagers weren't just worshipping a man, they were clinging to the idea that sometimes, just sometimes, the universe bends for the little guy. And isn't that a hope as old as humanity itself? Human minds are meaning-making machines, hardwired to stitch coherence from chaos, especially when faced with events that defy explanation. When the scaffold failed and the condemned man walked free, the villagers weren't just witnessing a fluke. They were confronting a crack in their understanding of how the world worked. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort we feel when reality clashes with deeply held beliefs. For people raised to see executions as divine justice, a botched hanging wasn't just unsettling, it was existential. Their brains scrambled to resolve the contradiction, and the simplest answer became the most compelling. This wasn't an accident, this was a sign. Mass hysteria likely played a role too. In close-knit communities under stress, like a medieval village grappling with famine, disease, and feudal oppression, collective emotions spread like wildfire. One witness's gasp of "miracle" became a dozen echoed affirmations by nightfall. The phenomenon mirrors modern cases like the 15th century dancing plague, where entire towns succumbed to uncontrollable dancing fits, or more recently, the June bug epidemic, where factory workers convinced themselves they'd been bitten by invisible insects. When fear or awe takes root in a group, rationality often buckles under the weight of shared conviction, but perhaps the most powerful force at work was hope. Medieval life offered little mercy to the poor. Disease, hunger, and arbitrary violence were constant companions. The survivors' defiance of death wasn't just a curiosity. It was a loophole in a system that had always seemed immutable. If the gallows could fail, maybe other inevitabilities could too. Unfair taxes, cruel lords, even early graves. The movement didn't just give villagers something to believe in, it gave them a psychological weapon against despair. This wasn't blind fanaticism, it was a survival mechanism. Studies of disaster survivors show that those who find meaning in trauma recover faster. For the villagers, the scaffold became a symbol of resilience, a way to reframe their suffering as part of a larger, sacred narrative. The iron axe charms they forged weren't just talismans, they were tiny acts of defiance, a way to carry the miracle in their pockets as a reminder, the world can bend. Yet the same psychology that birthed the movement also sowed its unraveling. As factions formed, each projecting their own needs onto the survivor, confirmation bias took hold. Matthias's followers saw signs of divine justice in every misfortune, while Elsbeth's circle interpreted the survivor's silence as mystical wisdom. The human brain excels at cherry-picking evidence to fit pre-existing beliefs, a trait that turned unity into division. What lingers isn't just a historical curiosity, but a mirror. Today, we might scoff at medieval superstitions, yet we still cluster around modern miracles, medical anomalies, UFO sightings, viral stories of improbable survival. The villager's story reminds us that the need to believe in the extraordinary isn't a relic of the past. It's a thread in the fabric of how we cope with a world that so often refuses to make sense. The village transformation from skepticism to fervor wasn't just about one man's survival. It was a masterclass in how tightly woven communities incubate and amplify belief. Picture a place where every face is familiar, where gossip travels faster than smoke on the wind. In such an environment, ideas don't just spread, they mutate, gaining strength with each retelling. When the first witness gasped, "Miracle," it wasn't just a personal reaction, it was a social cue, a signal to others that this event demanded collective interpretation. Anthropologists call this pluralistic ignorance, the tendency for individuals to assume everyone else understands something they don't. In the absence of clear answers, the villagers turned to each other, their shared confusion becoming a crucible for conviction. Social pressure played an invisible but relentless role. Imagine being the lone skeptic in a crowd of weeping believers, your doubts drowned out by cries of "sacred sign." The human brain is wired to prioritize belonging over truth, a survival holdover from our tribal past. Those who hesitated faced more than just spiritual isolation. They risked losing trade partnerships, marriage prospects, even physical safety. Records hint at a tavern keeper who mocked the movement, only to find his ale barrels mysteriously emptied overnight. No one threatened him outright, but the message was clear: conformity wasn't optional. This wasn't blind faith, it was faith enforced by the unspoken rules of communal living, where deviation could mean social exile. Yet there was another, more intoxicating force at work: the thrill of rebellion. For peasants whose lives were dictated by church bells and tax collectors, the movement offered a rare taste of agency. Tossing a coin onto the scaffold wasn't just piety, it was a tiny act of defiance, a way to flip the script on the very powers that had orchestrated the failed execution. Sociologists see parallels in modern fringe movements, where adherents often care less about doctrine than the rush of rejecting mainstream norms. The villagers' faith thrived not despite its illegitimacy, but because of it. Every band gathering, every confiscated charm only deepened their sense of being part of something radical, something theirs. Identity became inseparable from belief. Wearing an iron axe charm wasn't just protection, it was a badge declaring, "I saw the truth when others looked away." This phenomenon mirrors contemporary online subcultures, where shared jargon and symbols create instant kinship among strangers. The movement gave villagers something feudalism rarely permitted: a sense of chosenness unrelated to birth or status. A cobbler could kneel beside a farmer at the scaffold, both equal in their newfound spiritual elite. That empowerment, however fleeting, helps explain why the faith persisted even as pressures mounted to abandon it. Wasn't just apostasy, it was self-erasure. Modern parallels abound, from QAnon's rapid spread in digital echo chambers to the manic energy of political rallies. The same ingredients recur: a triggering anomaly, collective sense-making, and the addictive allure of belonging to the awakened. What makes the medieval case unique is its physical intimacy. Unlike today's viral myths born in the anonymity of screens, this belief moved hand to hand, hearth to hearth, its power magnified by the warmth of shared breath in cold rooms. Yet both eras reveal the same truth: when people feel powerless, they'll grasp at any narrative that makes them feel like protagonists rather than pawns. The movement's collapse, too, followed a textbook sociological script. As external persecution intensified, the cost of belief grew unsustainable. Parents who'd once proudly worn axe charms now hid them, fearing their children would be barred from apprenticeship. The blacksmith who forged relics began accepting communion again, not out of conviction, but because his wife begged him to think of their daughter's future. This gradual erosion mirrors how modern cults dissolve, not with dramatic showdowns, but with quiet defections as real-world consequences outweigh the rewards of rebellion. The faith didn't fail because people stopped believing. It failed because belief became incompatible with survival, yet traces lingered in the village social DNA. Long after the scaffold was ash, certain families still intermarried, their shared history of defiance creating invisible bonds. Anecdotes suggest these households were first to join peasant uprisings decades later, as if the movement had imprinted a template for resistance. Herein lies the bittersweet irony. While the faith as an institution faded, its spirit, the audacity to imagine a different order, outlasted altars and icons woven into the fabric of how this community understood itself. Because once you've seen the rules break, you can never quite forget they're made to be bent. Survival against impossible odds has always carried a whiff of the divine, as if cheating death isn't just luck, but a glimpse behind the curtain of fate itself. The medieval villagers weren't alone in seeing holiness in the survivors' endurance. Across time and cultures, those who walk away from the executioner's block or the battlefield unscathed become something more than human. They become vessels for the inexplicable. Consider Joan of Arc, the peasant girl who survived battle after battle. Her followers convinced her very flesh was charmed by God. Or the countless resurrection myths from Osiris pieced back together in Egyptian lore to Jesus emerging from the tomb. Stories that hinge not just on life after death, but on life-defying death. What unites these tales isn't just the miracle, but the way it disrupts the natural order, forcing witnesses to ask, if death can be undone, what else might be possible? The psychology behind this is primal. Near-death experiences trigger a cascade of existential questions: why this person? Why this moment? And religion offers the most satisfying answer: because it was meant to be. Anthropologists point to the sacred survivor archetype found everywhere, from Siberian shamanic traditions to Pacific Islander folklore. In Fiji, warriors who survived ritual strangulation trials were believed to channel ancestral spirits. In medieval Europe, saints' relics often included fragments of the ropes or blades that failed to kill them, as if the objects absorbed divine power through their own inadequacy. The survivor's scaffold, then, wasn't just a site of worship, it was a magnet for meaning, pulling every desperate hope and unanswered prayer into its orbit. Yet there's a crucial difference between the survivor and figures like Joan of Arc. Joan's sanctity was endorsed by the Church, her victories framed as divine favor for a holy cause. The survivor, though, was a paradox, a heretic who performed no miracles, uttered no prophecies, yet became sacred simply by persisting. His power came not from institutional approval, but from the raw, collective need of those who'd been told their suffering was God's will. When the axe failed, it wasn't just a man who was spared. It was the villagers' own unspoken longing for a world where justice wasn't always reserved for the afterlife. This tension between official sanctity and grassroots reverence echoes through history. The early Christian martyrs were embraced by the Church, but what of the unofficial saints, the ones who inspired cults without papal approval? Figures like the 12th century mystic Christina the Astonishing, who supposedly survived drownings and falls from heights, her followers interpreting her endurance as proof of heavenly intervention. Like the survivor, Christina's legend thrived in the gaps of institutional control, her story a testament to the human hunger for miracles that don't require a priest's permission slip. Modern parallels abound. Think of near-death experiences today, their stories of white lights and tunnels spawning best-selling books and TED Talks, or the secular miracles we cling to. The cancer survivor whose remission defies statistics, the hiker found alive after weeks in the wilderness. These narratives tap into the same ancient wiring, the need to believe that fate isn't random, that survival has purpose. The medieval villagers would have understood this instinctively. Their faith wasn't just in the survivor, but in the idea that the universe might occasionally tip its hand, offering not just justice but mercy, a notion as radical now as it was then. What makes these stories endure isn't their theology, but their humanity. The survivor didn't choose sainthood. It was thrust upon him by people desperate to see the world as something more than a meat grinder of suffering. And in that, he joins a lineage of accidental prophets, the ones who never asked to be symbols but became them anyway, simply because they lived when everyone expected them to die. Their greatest miracle isn't cheating death, but revealing how fragile the boundaries between the ordinary and the sacred really are. The medieval villagers weren't the last to turn inexplicable survival into sacred spectacle. Fast forward to 2016, when a video of a toddler crawling unharmed from a car wreck in Brazil went viral. Locals dubbed him the Miracle Child, flocking to the crash site to leave toys and light candles, just as their medieval counterparts had piled offerings at the scaffold. Within weeks, the roadside became a shrine, the twisted metal festooned with ribbons and handwritten prayers. Authorities cleared the site repeatedly, but the tributes kept reappearing, a testament to the same human impulse that once filled a village square with axe-shaped charms, the need to believe that sometimes the universe bends its own rules for the smallest among us. Then there's the curious case of Tsutomu Yamaguchi, the Japanese engineer who survived both the Hiroshima and Nagasaki atomic blasts in 1945. Though he never sought veneration, his double survival spawned a quiet cult following. Strangers mailed him water to bless, convinced he carried some divine radiation resistance. Like the medieval survivor, Yamaguchi seemed baffled by his own legend, once telling a reporter, "I'm just a man who got unlucky twice." Yet his very existence became a Rorschach test. Pacifists saw him as proof of war's futility, nationalists as a symbol of endurance. The villagers would have understood, when reality defies explanation, we mold it to fit our deepest hopes or fears. Social media has only amplified this ancient pattern. Consider the Balloon Boy hoax of 2009, where a child was mistakenly thought to be drifting across Colorado in a homemade aircraft. For hours, millions clung to updates, breathless with the possibility of a miracle rescue. When the boy was found hiding at home, the disappointment felt almost spiritual, a reminder of how desperately we crave narratives where the innocent cheat fate. Online, these moments crystallize into modern folklore. The ghost caught on a subway camera, the angel spotted in a wildfire photo, each thrives in the same fertile ground where the survivor's legend took root, the space between what we see and what we need to believe. Even science isn't immune. When physicist Aaron Blake survived falling into the Large Hadron Collider in 2022, dodging particle beams that should have vaporized him, forums lit up with theories about quantum immortality and divine intervention. Never mind that the beams were inactive, the story spread because it felt true. Like the medieval executioner's axe that shattered mid-swing, despite no fragments being found, Blake's tale grew grander with each retelling. Both cases reveal a universal truth. Facts matter less than the frisson of the impossible made plausible. The darkest parallels emerge in conspiracy movements like QAnon, where cryptic online posts became scripture for thousands. Like the villagers passing the survivors every sigh for hidden meaning, followers dissected drops for clues, their faith growing stronger with each unfulfilled prophecy. Both movements thrived on ambiguity. The survivor's refusal to proclaim himself a messiah made him more compelling, just as Q's anonymity lent the posts an aura of omniscience. And both collapsed under the weight of their own contradictions, leaving behind pockets of true believers clutching at fading embers. Yet there's a crucial difference. Medieval heresies were grassroots rebellions against top-down control. Many modern viral faiths are engineered from above, their narratives weaponized by algorithms and bad actors. The villagers' faith was a candle lit in defiance of institutional darkness. Today, our digital scaffolds, the platforms where miracles and madness spread alike, are themselves the tools of new overlords. Perhaps that's why these stories haunt us. They're not just relics of superstition, but mirrors held up to our own hunger for meaning in a world where the axes still fall, just in subtler ways. The survivor's village would have recognized one truth we often forget. Every era gets the miracles it deserves. Theirs was a tangible defiance of cold iron and colder justice. Ours flicker across screens, ephemeral as pixels, yet no less powerful. Because whether it's a medieval scaffold or a viral tweet, the human heart still leaps at the same question: what if the next time the blade misses? And in that question, 500 years collapse into a single, timeless hope. History rarely offers neat answers, but it whispers lessons in the spaces between facts. And this forgotten medieval movement speaks volumes about the tangled dance between belief and power. At its core, the story isn't just about a failed execution or even the faith it spawned. It's about what happens when the powerless witness the unimaginable, a crack in the system that's supposed to crush them. For a fleeting moment, the villagers glimpsed a world where divine justice didn't align with the scaffold, where a nobody could become sacred not through church decree, but through sheer collective will. That disruption, not the miracle itself, was the real threat, because when people start believing their suffering might be optional, rulers lose sleep. Consider how societies throughout time have grappled with the unexplainable. When plagues struck medieval Europe, some turned to flagellant processions, whipping themselves raw to appease an angry god. Others blamed Jews or witches, burning scapegoats to restore their illusion of control. The villagers' response was different, not destruction, but creation. Faced with an event that defied logic, they didn't retreat into fear. They built a new framework of meaning, brick by humble brick. Their makeshift altars and iron charms weren't just acts of devotion, they were acts of defiance, a way to say, we decide what's holy. Yet the movement's fragility is just as revealing. Without institutions to codify its beliefs, the faith relied entirely on communal memory, and memory, as it turns out, is a fragile thing. The church had parchment, ink, and centuries of bureaucracy. The villagers had whispers and worn-out axe charms. Historians call this asymmetric endurance, the way structured power outlasts grassroots fervor simply because it's built to. When the bishop's scribes scratched the survivor's name from the records, they weren't just erasing a man, they were proving how easily the powerless can be unwritten from their own stories. But here's the twist: the past never fully obeys its censors. For every official document burned, some stubborn trace remains, a lullaby humming beneath the surface of sanctioned history, a child's doll hidden in a tree trunk. These fragments tell us something vital about belief. It doesn't need cathedrals to survive. It just needs someone, somewhere, to keep the embers warm. The villagers may have returned to their pews, but they did so changed. Once you've seen the scaffold fail, you can never quite unsee it. This tension between institutional might and the persistence of quiet rebellion echoes far beyond medieval squares. Think of how modern myths emerge from tragedy: the Angel of Auschwitz said to have comforted prisoners, or the Lady of the Lamp stories after natural disasters. These aren't just tales, they're coping mechanisms, ways to assert that even in the darkest moments, meaning can't be fully extinguished. The survivors' village crafted their own light, however briefly, and that act itself is a lesson. Belief isn't just about gods or miracles. It's about who gets to decide what counts as real. So what lingers isn't just a curiosity of medieval history, but a mirror. In an age of deepfakes and algorithmic truths, we're still wrestling with the same questions. When the unexpected happens, when a pandemic upends lives or a political order trembles, we still cluster around narratives that promise patterns in the chaos. The villagers would have understood our modern conspiracy theories and viral miracles perfectly. They knew, as we do, that the human mind would rather believe in a flawed explanation than sit with unbearable uncertainty. Perhaps the most haunting lesson is how quickly the extraordinary becomes ordinary again. The survivors' followers didn't abandon their faith because they stopped believing. They bent because the weight of the world eventually bows even the sturdiest backs. Yet in their bending, they left something unbroken. 5 centuries later, we're still piecing together their story, still moved by its raw humanity. That's the final irony. The powers that tried to erase them unwittingly proved their point. Nothing is ever truly forgotten, not if someone, somewhere, is still listening for the echo of an axe that refused to fall. The disappearance of the survivor remains one of history's most tantalizing riddles. Did he slip away under cover of darkness, weary of the weight of his own legend? Was he silenced by the Lord's men, his body dumped in an unmarked grave to sever the movement's heart? Or did he simply walk into the forest one evening, leaving behind a trail of footprints that vanished at the river's edge? The lack of closure only deepened the mystery, transforming him from a man into a ghost, a blank space where hope and speculation rushed in. Some whispered he'd fled to a monastery, trading his notoriety for a life of silent penance. Others swore they glimpsed him years later in distant market towns, his face lined with age but his eyes still holding that uncanny calm. The most haunting theory: that he never left at all, that he's buried beneath the village itself, hidden in some forgotten cellar or sealed well, his presence lingering like a shadow in the stones. Equally enigmatic are the whispers of secret adherents who kept the faith alive long after the scaffold was ash. Parish records from neighboring towns hint at arrests for axe worship decades later, suggesting the movement didn't die, it just learned to hide. A merchant's ledger from the 15th century mentions a shipment of iron charms confiscated near the old village, their shapes suspiciously reminiscent of blades. Then there's the curious case of a traveling friar's diary, which describes a remote farmstead where the family still prayed before a carved wooden axe every harvest moon. Were these isolated holdouts or threads of a deeper, quieter resistance? The Church's frantic efforts to stamp out every ember suggest they feared the latter. Historians still spar over the most contentious question: was the survivors' endurance truly miraculous or just a fluke of physics? Some argue the executioner's axe, poorly weighted or dulled by use, simply glanced off the block. Others point to contemporary accounts of prisoners surviving hangings due to misplaced knots or fragile ropes. But this clinical explanation stumbles against the sheer improbability. The fact that the failure happened not in isolation, but at the precise moment when a desperate village needed proof that justice could falter. Coincidence or providence? The answer may lie less in medieval mechanics than in the human psyche's refusal to accept that some moments aren't meant to mean something. Perhaps the greatest unanswered question isn't about the survivor's fate, but his legacy. Did the movement's collapse prove the futility of rebellion, or did it plant seeds that flowered in later peasant revolts? When the villagers of the German Peasants' War rose up in 1524, their banners bore not just crosses, but axes, a symbol some scholars trace back to our forgotten heresy. Even today, folklorists uncover traces: a grandmother's rhyme about the man the rope refused, a blacksmith's mark shaped like a broken blade. These fragments suggest that while the faith as an institution faded, its essence, the audacity to believe in mercy amid brutality, refused to die. Theories multiply where evidence thins. Some posit the survivor was illiterate, leaving no letters to decipher. Others wonder if his silence was itself a strategy, a way to let others project their needs onto him, making his story infinitely adaptable. A handful of radical historians even suggest he was a fiction all along, a collective hallucination born of trauma. But the scaffold's charred remnants, the iron charms tucked between floorboards, these are stubbornly real. They whisper that something extraordinary happened in that village, even if its truth now lies beyond recovery. What lingers isn't just mystery, but possibility. The survivor's tale endures precisely because it refuses resolution, leaving room for each generation to ask, what would I have seen that morning? A liar, a saint, or just a man ordinary in every way except one who somehow, against all odds, walked away. Every summer, in a quiet corner of Europe where mist still clings to the hills as it did centuries ago, a peculiar transformation takes place. Locals and visitors alike gather in a village square, not for a typical medieval fair, but for a reenactment of that fateful morning when the axe failed to fall. The air hums with the same tension that once gripped the original witnesses, as an actor in tattered robes kneels at a reconstructed scaffold. The executioner raises his prop axe, the crowd holds its breath, and when the blade glances off, thanks to a clever bit of stagecraft, the gasps are genuine. This isn't just theater, it's an act of collective memory, a way to touch the past through the raw power of what if. The event is the brainchild of a local historian named Klaus, whose childhood fascination with the survivor's tale became a lifelong mission. We're not just retelling a story, he explains, adjusting a replica iron charm around his neck. We're asking people to stand where those villagers stood, to feel that jolt of awe and uncertainty. His team scours archives for authentic details, the exact dimensions of medieval scaffolds, the type of rope used in nooses, even the traditional prayers recited before executions. But the real magic happens when attendees, many descendants of the original villagers, bring their own family lore. An elderly woman once handed Klaus a rusted nail passed down through generations, whispered to be from the true scaffold. Whether it's genuine or not hardly matters. The belief itself is the relic. Beyond the annual reenactment, the survivor's story has seeped into contemporary art. A Berlin-based collective recently staged an avant-garde play where the scaffold becomes a metaphor for modern injustices, prison systems, wage slavery, the guillotine of societal expectations. The actor playing the survivor remains silent throughout, while audience members are invited to hammer makeshift axes into the set, each blow a vote for what deserves to be unbroken. Meanwhile, in a dimly lit Liverpool gallery, an installation features hundreds of iron charms suspended from the ceiling, each engraved with a name of someone executed in the past decade. The artist cites the medieval movement as direct inspiration. They turned survival into rebellion. We're turning remembrance into reckoning. Tourism has followed the legend's revival, albeit cautiously. Unlike typical heritage sites that glorify knights and castles, this village's draws are quieter but no less potent. Visitors trace a self-guided miracle trail past the old execution site, now marked by a tasteful stone etching, the riverbank where the survivor supposedly vanished, and the church where his followers were excommunicated. The local bakery even sells unbroken loaves, crusty sourdough rounds scored with an axe mark, a nod to the bread left as offerings. Some residents initially balked at commercializing the past until a school teacher pointed out the irony. They burned the scaffold to erase him. We're rebuilding it in our way to keep him alive, yet preservation walks a tightrope between honor and exploitation. When a streaming platform proposed a dramatic series about the survivor, the script twisted his story into a supernatural thriller, complete with ghostly visitations and secret witch cults. Outraged, the village council drafted a truth covenant for adapters: no invented conspiracies, no mangling of core themes. Their stance echoes a growing global debate: who gets to profit from history's footnotes. The answer here seems to lie in stewardship rather than ownership. At the reenactment's climax, when the actor playing the survivor walks free, it's not applause that follows but a hushed stillness. In that moment, 5 centuries collapse, and the real miracle isn't the blade's failure, but the stubborn refusal to let wonder die. Efforts to pin down the survivor's legacy now span continents. In Vermont, a community theater group performs an annual Ballad of the Unbroken, blending medieval chants with bluegrass harmonies. A Tokyo manga artist reimagined the tale as a samurai epic, where a Ronin survives a dishonorable beheading, sparking a peasant uprising. Closest to the original spirit, perhaps, is a guerrilla art project in Brazil. Activists scatter wooden axe charms near sites of police violence, each stamped with a QR code linking to the medieval story. The message is clear: some truths are too potent to stay buried. They resurface, adapt, and find new voices when the world needs reminding that scaffolds, in any era, are only as strong as the fear that holds them up. What began as a botched execution in a forgotten village now thrives in this kaleidoscope of retellings. The survivor would likely barely recognize himself in some of them, but that's the point. Legends aren't fossils, they're rivers, carving new paths through each generation's landscape of hope and rage. Whether etched onto a tourist's souvenir charm or shouted from a protest stage, his story's power endures not despite its ambiguities, but because of them. After all, the best miracles leave room for the unbelievers. They're the cracks where the light and the questions keep getting in. The allure of the failed execution and its aftermath isn't confined to medieval history. It's a thread that runs through our most gripping stories, from ancient myths to blockbuster films. Take the life of Brian, Monty Python's irreverent take on accidental messiahs, where a man becomes a prophet despite his desperate pleas that he's not the Messiah. Like the medieval survivor, Brian's followers project their own meaning onto his mundane actions. turning him into a symbol he never asked to be. The comedy works because it exposes a universal truth. The line between savior and scapegoat is often drawn by the crowd, not the chosen one. Then there's the Green Mile, where John Coffey, a wrongly condemned man, possesses inexplicable healing powers. His execution, like the medieval scaffold scene, becomes a moment of profound moral reckoning. The guards who oversee his death aren't just enforcers of justice, they're witnesses to something beyond their understanding, left to grapple with the fallout of killing a man who might have been divine. The story taps into the same unease that gripped the villagers. What if the system got it wrong? What if holiness hides in the last place we'd think to look? Fantasy literature loves this trope too. In Game of Thrones, the Lord of Light's followers repeatedly resurrect Beric Dondarrion, his survival defying the natural order. Each return leaves him a little less himself, a little more vessel, mirroring the medieval survivor's gradual erosion under the weight of others' expectations. George R.R. Martin understands what the villagers knew instinctively. Resurrection isn't just about cheating death, it's about the cost of becoming a symbol. Even sci-fi wrestles with these themes. The Matrix's Neo is a reluctant messiah whose survival against impossible odds sparks a rebellion. Like the survivor's followers, Neo's disciples cling to prophecies, desperate for proof that their fight isn't futile. The parallels run deeper than plot. They're about the human need to believe that systems of control aren't infallible, that one person's defiance can crack the world open. Why do these stories resonate across centuries? Because they're not really about axes or executioners. They're about the moment when the powerless realize the rules aren't immutable. The medieval villagers, Life of Brian's fanatics, the Green Mile's guards, they all face the same terrifying, exhilarating question. If the scaffold can fail, what else might? That's the hook. Whether played for laughs or tears, these narratives remind us that faith and rebellion often wear the same face. And in a world that still feels rigged for the powerful, that's a story we'll never stop telling. Today, the village where the impossible once happened still clings to the edges of modernity, its cobbled streets whispering secrets to those who slow down enough to listen. Nestled in a quiet valley between two misty mountain ranges, it's the kind of place where time feels measured in church bells and harvest cycles rather than minutes. Visitors can walk the same uneven stones where villagers once gasped at the failed execution, now marked by a simple brass plaque embedded near the old square's central well, its inscription worn smooth by centuries of fingertips tracing the words, "Here the blade turned." For the truly curious, the journey begins at the village unassuming history museum, a converted granary where a single room is devoted to the survivor's legacy. Among faded tapestries and rusted farm tools, a glass case holds the most prized artifact, a fragment of the original scaffold, its grain still darkened by what might be old blood or centuries of candle smoke. The curator, a wiry woman whose family has lived here for generations, will tell you it's the iron nails that intrigue historians, each one carefully straightened, as if pulled out by trembling hands and saved as talismans. Nearby, a touchscreen reconstructs the execution scene using parish records and archaeological finds, letting you stand in that fateful crowd with a swipe of your finger. Pilgrims of a different sort often hike to the riverbank where the survivor was last seen. The path winds past fields still divided by medieval stone walls, their mossy crevices hiding wild thyme and the occasional iron charm left by modern devotees. At the water's edge, a gnarled oak bears the scars of countless pocketknives' initials carved by lovers, symbols resembling axes scratched by those hoping to channel the legend's resilience. Local guides warn against taking the folklore too literally, though. The river doesn't give up its secrets, laughs one fisherman, baiting his hook with a wink. But it's happy to take your coins if you toss them in for luck. Every midsummer, the village hosts its festival of the unbroken, a curiously joyous affair given its origins. Children weave garlands of blue cornflowers, said to be the survivor's favorite, while bakers compete to craft the most elaborate loaf scored with an edible axe mark. The highlight comes at dusk, when lanterns shaped like nooses and blades are released into the sky, not as macabre symbols, but as flickering reminders that light can rise from darkness. Tourists expecting solemnity are often surprised by the laughter ringing through the square, the clinking of glasses filled with Dodger's Ale, a local brew named for the man who dodged death. For those who can't make the pilgrimage, nearby cities offer echoes of the story. The regional capital's museum keeps a grimly fascinating justice and mercy exhibit, featuring executioners' swords, pardon petitions, and tucked in a corner, a handwritten list of miraculous escapes that includes the village legend between the lines of official skepticism. Meanwhile, an avant-garde theater troupe in Vienna stages an annual The Axe That Didn't Fall, blending medieval chants with modern dance to explore how one moment of defiance ripples through time. Standing in that village square today, with the scent of woodsmike and fresh bread in the air, it's easy to dismiss the legend as mere superstition. But then you notice the way old women still touch the well's rim before drawing water, or how farmers leave the first sheaf of wheat at the plaque each autumn. The survivor may be centuries gone, his name erased by time, yet something lingers not in relics or rituals, but in the quiet understanding that miracles aren't always grand interventions. Sometimes they're just a blade missing its mark, a crack in the universe wide enough for hope to slip through. And whether you believe in divine intervention or dumb luck, that's a story worth traveling for. From a single moment of failed steel and held breath, an entire belief system bloomed fragile, fervent, and fleeting. The journey from botched execution to vanished faith is more than just a medieval curiosity. It's a map of the human soul, charting our desperate need to carve meaning from the inexplicable. Consider the sheer improbability of it all. An axe's edge glancing away, a crowd's collective gasp crystallizing into conviction, and a condemned man walking free only to vanish into legend. What began as a bureaucratic accident became a revelation, proving that miracles aren't always acts of divine intervention. Sometimes they're simply cracks in the machinery of power, and what we pour into those cracks says everything about who we are. Faith, survival, and oblivion weave through this story like the threads of a frayed tapestry. The villagers didn't just see a man cheat death, they saw a glimmer of a world where justice wasn't monopolized by the powerful. Their faith wasn't blind, it was defiant, a refusal to accept that the scaffold's verdict was final. Yet survival, whether miraculous or mundane, is a fragile foundation for belief. The survivor himself became a prisoner of his own myth, his silence a canvas for others' hopes, until even his disappearance became part of the lore. And oblivion, it crept in not with a dramatic collapse, but with the quiet erosion of daily life, the way a mother might tuck away an iron charm to protect her child's future, or a farmer might kneel in church while still tracing an axe shape in the dirt. History is littered with such ephemeral faiths, risen from the ashes of singular, unexplainable moments. Think of the weeping statues that draw thousands before being debunked, or the modern-day angel sightings in subway tunnels. These aren't mere delusions, they're proof of our relentless hunger for the extraordinary in a world that often feels rigidly ordinary. The medieval villagers' religion didn't fade because they stopped believing. It faded because belief, no matter how fervent, eventually bends beneath the weight of survival. The real miracle wasn't that the axe missed, it's that, for a fleeting season, an entire village dared to imagine a different order. So here's the question that lingers like mist over those forgotten fields. What would you have believed if you'd stood in that square? Would you have seen a trick of physics or the hand of something greater? Would you have touched the scaffold's wood with reverence or scoffed at the hysteria? There's no right answer, only the reminder that we're all just one inexplicable moment away from becoming witnesses, believers, or skeptics. The story of this lost religion isn't just a relic, it's a mirror. And in its reflection, we're forced to ask, what cracks in our own world might we be mistaking for miracles? Now it's your turn. Drop your thoughts below. Would you have followed the unbroken or dismissed him as a lucky criminal? And if you're hungry for more tales where history and mystery collide, don't forget to explore our playlist of hidden histories. After all, the past is never really gone. It's just waiting for the right story to bring it back to